All right, well, good morning, everyone. Let's go ahead and get started. So my name is Imran, and I have the privilege of moderating this panel this morning. So this is the Early Stage Therapeutics panel, and specifically an investor perspective on early stage therapeutics. We have a distinguished group of panelists with us, and I would also say a very diverse group in terms of the funds that they represent. So in a moment, I'll give them an opportunity to introduce themselves. But before we do that, I'll give a brief introduction of myself, and then I'll give you a roadmap for where we'd like to go during this panel. So as I said, my name is Imran. I'm currently the Chief Business Officer at Cydan. Prior to Cydan, I was actually an investor myself. I was at OrbiMed Advisors on the venture capital team for about 5 years. And prior to that, I was on the sell side at Counter Company, and I started a nonprofit in the rare disease space. So Cydan, in a nutshell, is a venture-backed orphan drug accelerator. We've got 5 investors, one of whom is represented here on the panel. They consist of NEA, Longitude, Pfizer Ventures, Lundbeck Fund, and Alexandria Real Estate. And our model is really to look for assets in the orphan disease space, and to evaluate them, to de-risk them, and to start companies around those assets. And so in many ways, we're kind of a hybrid between a fund and an operating group. We evaluate technologies, and we take the most promising ones forward. Our investors have about $200 million in reserve capital to fund companies around these assets. So that's Cydan in a nutshell. So in terms of the panel, after introductions, we'll spend some time discussing the current funding landscape. So we have a number of questions which we'll go through, just discussing the landscape currently in terms of capital that's available. Second of all, we'll spend some time on strategies to access this capital. So as for early stage companies, what are some strategies they can seek to pursue this capital? And last of all, we'll open up for question and answers. So without further ado, maybe we'll start to my right with Scott. You can just say a little bit about yourself, and then specifically the fund that you represent and your investment profile.
Absolutely. Welcome everyone. So my name is Scott Wiener. I am a partner at Pappas Capital. As far as my personal background, I've been on the buy side as a healthcare investor for 17 years, 15 in the venture space, 2 at a hedge fund, and then started my career on Wall Street. So Pappas Capital is a North Carolina-based life science-focused venture capital firm. We've been around for 25 years. We invest mostly in therapeutic companies with a minor focus in devices and diagnostics. On the therapeutic side, we invest anywhere from approximately lead asset identification through phase 2 proof of concept. We are therapeutic area agnostic and invest across the US and into Canada. We are investing out of our 5th fund, which we raised last year. So our bite size is all of our funds have been about 100 million in size, translating to a bite size of 6 to 8 million through the life of a company, 2 to 4 initially, plus reserves. We have made 6 investments out of that fund to date of a planned 14, so still have significant dry powder to invest further. And one thing to add is it's a pretty small group, so along the way, if you guys have questions, please feel free to raise your hand. The more interactive this is, the more interesting it is, at least to me on these panels.
Morning, everyone. Marta New. I'm a partner at Agent Capital. Agent Capital is a relatively new fund here in Boston. We're biotech venture capital focused. Our group comes out of Baxalta and Baxter Ventures, so we're a spin out of those corporate groups. We are a first-time fund, but not first-time managers. And we're targeting about $100 million fund. We focus on therapeutics exclusively, and we're stage agnostic, so we can invest in very early stage technologies that are preclinical all the way to clinical stage assets. We do focus on therapeutic areas that are in rare diseases, neurology, immunology, and oncology. And our bite size is for earlier stage companies 3 to 4 with reserves, and for later stage 2. My background is I started my career in academia. I'm a PhD immunologist, and I spent a number of years at Northwestern's technology transfer office, spinning out new companies and out licensing to large pharma. So I'm no stranger to very early stage types of assets, and we love to guide our companies in terms of strategy and drug development. And it's a very nerdy three-person team. We're all PhDs, PharmDs, and we like to roll up our sleeves, which I think for early stage investing, that's a lot of fun because it's our passion. So good to be here. Thanks for the invitation.
My name is Vibhash. I represent New Enterprise Associates. I'm a principal in the healthcare team. NEA is currently investing out of its 17th fund. Our funds encompass both technology investing and healthcare investing out of a common pool of capital. Most recent fund is 3.3 billion, out of which the best way to think about the healthcare piece is around 40% of that is dedicated to healthcare in every fund. And within that, apart from the Therapeutics group, which is around 75% of all our healthcare investing dollars, we also have devices and healthcare services. I specifically work mostly with the Therapeutics group, and the couple of philosophies are we are geography agnostic, theoretically stage agnostic, but there are some caveats to that. Typical bite sizes are between 5 and 20 per round, and we want to scale up to 100 million per company over its lifetime. Given the size of the fund, we also invest in public equities, and the general philosophy is stay with a company for long. And we have had prior examples where we have stayed with a company from Series A to the second follow-on after an IPO to optimize our returns. The other core philosophy of our investing is we work hands-on very closely with our companies, as Imran will testify. And that involves sitting on the board, proactively helping with anything from recruiting to opening up our Rolodex and proactively helping the companies grow and build. And generally, we are very patient, long-term oriented, fundamental investors. In terms of my own background, joined NEA about 3 years ago, came from AstraZeneca, and prior to that was at J&J. So big pharma background, primarily transactions and corporate strategy, and prior to that trained as a scientist.
Thanks. Last but not the least, so I'm in many ways, I'm Kuldeep Niyote. I'm a little bit sort of odd on this panel in the sense that I work with Johnson & Johnson Innovation, which is one of many of the companies within the sort of the bigger J&J umbrella. So I say I'm a little bit different from the rest of them because Johnson & Johnson being such a big company about 5 years ago implemented the notion of J&J innovation, and we call it the J&J innovation model or the J&J innovation concept. And we specifically put this concept together because we wanted to focus on investments in very early stage opportunities. So in many ways, we do what everyone else on this panel does, make investments, but in our case, the investments are strategic in nature. We tend to focus on opportunities that are before clinical proof of concept. And given that we want to make strategic investments, we get very creative in the way we structure some of these investments. And by that, I really mean sometimes we have a very high interest in the technology platform or the therapeutic that a particular venture is pursuing. And consequently, we might make, for example, a combination of an equity type investment and an R&D collaboration. Other times, we make a strict equity investment depending on the nature of the company that is getting matured. Now, beyond making investments, J&J Innovation also enables innovation in local ecosystems. And as part of that, we have an incubator facility called J Labs, where we incubate companies that we provide a lot of support to those companies. They can leverage the expertise that's apparent in the bigger Johnson & Johnson company, all the way from regulatory insights into manufacturing insights, into discovery insights. And our corporate venture arm is part of this bigger J&J innovation. As you can imagine, we partner with them, JLabs partners with them, and if there's a need to leverage that equity, we do that. And actually, very recently, another group has been incorporated into J&J Innovation, which is our group that's World Without Disease. And that group specifically focuses on early disease detection and interception. And this is an area that J&J has become very interested in. And we felt that it was an area where in our bigger J&J company that we couldn't really get this initiative off the ground, but we wanted to take, I'll use this word which is overused, an innovative approach in enabling opportunities of detecting earlier disease and doing early disease interception. So with that, I'll very quickly, like everyone, give my background. I've been in big pharma all my career, discovery scientist through various ranks, taking small molecule, large molecules to the clinic. But over the last 5 years or so, I've been in this type of sort of an external R&D role, as I call it, more of a search and evaluation role, but very focused on really finding opportunities of strategic interest to invest in.
Good. All right. Well, I thank all of you for those introductions. I also just want to reemphasize what Scott said earlier. We really want to make this interactive. I forgot to mention that earlier. So if you have questions along the way, please feel free to ask, and then we'll also leave some time at the very end. Okay, so this brings us to our first big topic, and that is to provide some context for the current funding landscape. So maybe I'll start back over here with Scott. And Scott, maybe could you tell us a little bit about what is your perspective on the current funding landscape and the availability of capital, and how has that impacted your investment strategy?
Okay, maybe before I answer that, I'm just curious, can people raise their hands if they work for a company that is venture-backed or wants to raise money from venture capital firms? Okay, so perspective on the current fundraising landscape. So I've been in venture for 15 years. I would say this is probably the most bullish, robust time for companies to raise capital, and even for ourselves as venture firms to raise capital for investment. And we've seen improvement in science and technology to enable better, more patient-specific treatments. I think that's driving some of the innovation and the new technologies you're seeing. And I think that's opened up the interest from strategics to get involved earlier stage with biotech companies. We've seen our companies partnering with J&Js and other companies earlier than they ever have. We've seen public investors being more interested in getting involved with biotech companies in an earlier stages to chase the significant value inflection point at phase 2 proof of concept. So there's a lot more money around the table. So from a company's perspective, for you in the audience, I would say I think that's really good. And I think if you've got a great idea, now is the best time to raise money, because not only is there a lot of money from the venture firms, and you heard NEA's fund is 3.3 billion is state fund. So you've got funds that are now 3 billion when they used to be the big healthcare funds and multi-funds were 500-600 million. So there's a lot of money out there for you guys to tap into. And importantly, it's not just from the traditional venture firms in the U.S., but now we're seeing that the venture space is becoming more global. We're seeing interest from investors outside the U.S., Europe, and especially Asia over the last couple of years. And so companies now, from my perspective, are raising money successfully. They're raising more money than they have in the past, so the size of financings have increased significantly, and I think that's all great for companies. From our standpoint, investors, for us, we're able to raise funds a little bit easier because there's more interest from investors in our funds as they see the attractive returns, which is great. So that capital can be deployed, and I think as we get more capital goes into the ecosystem. And as a reminder, for those that don't know how venture firms work that well, when we raise funds, we typically deploy them over several years. So the fact that a lot of people have raised new funds, we think there'll be ample capital to invest back into biotech companies for at least the next four years or so as the cycle continues. So I think overall, from a company standpoint, you guys should be really bullish on the current market environment.
Well, let me ask, and I'll open this up to the rest of the panelists. Are there any negatives associated with the incredible availability of capital in recent years?
Everyone's looking at me. So I start. Yeah, I think one negative that I see, again, coming from a big pharma perspective, it really is sometimes the valuation is a little bit off. Sometimes it's really very, very high, unrealistically high. So I think immuno-oncology as a space to invest in is a very typical example. There's a lot of anticipation. There's a lot of sort of promise that immuno-oncology is really going to be the way to go after cancer, and not that it has not been, but at the end of the day, we know today that only 20%, no more than 25% of the cancer patients who get immunotherapy, approved immunotherapies, do actually benefit from it, and the rest don't. And yes, we need to put a lot of investment and resource and efforts in trying to identify other immunomodulatory drugs that are going to treat the rest of the semi-odd patients. However, any opportunity, any venture that comes up in that space, it is evaluated at I believe, in a very, very high unrealistic manner. And because there is this abundance of cash available, I think that investors are willing to take that chance with the hope that something will come out. A couple of examples come into mind. IFM, a company that is pursuing a STING agonist, right? And here's an opportunity. Here's an opportunity where the asset is in the preclinical stage, and the overall sort of valuation that I believe the BMS that made a deal with them was over $1 billion, and it's just mind-boggling. So to me that's the biggest.
And maybe I'll bounce around. I'm going to ask Marta. So you have a new fund, and I'm going to try to bounce around on the panel here. So you have a new fund, and we've just discussed there's a lot of availability of capital. As a new fund, do you find it's more competitive to compete to actually get into deals, into the exciting deals? And then how do you manage that? If there are exciting deals, there's a lot of availability of capital. How do you think about compelling companies to allow your investment in this market?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So a couple of ways we're doing that. So as was mentioned, there's a high availability of cash, and so a lot is coming from how large the fund sizes are for some of these groups. And they would rather write a $10 or $15 million check than a $2 million check. So our fund, being a first-time fund, we can write a smaller check, so we don't have to push anyone out of the syndicate. So everybody this is a very collegial industry, and it really depends on collaboration and syndication. And we all work together, even when before the term sheet is issued, a small circle of a syndicate is formed. So collaborative approach in this industry is number one. And so the industry has been very kind to us and other funds, letting us into competitive deals. So for instance, we were an investor in Charisma Therapeutics. They just raised a Series A, led by AbbVie Ventures, and MRL Merck Ventures was participating in HealthCap. And so it was a larger round with players with very deep pockets, because we leveraged our relationships from our previous funds and the value that we can add and our commitment to do the following rounds. That's one. So it almost is differentiating funds in terms of how big of a check can one write. So some of these Series A are oversubscribed, unfortunately. Another trend that we're seeing is the rise of a larger seed round or a convertible note. Companies are waiting, or even investors are postponing valuation of very early stage technologies that are platform technologies that don't have leads identified. They want to avoid valuing them too quickly, too high. And we're seeing these days that these seed rounds that are in the form of a convertible note, because it gives the most flexibility and avoids valuation early on the rise. And then once when the company is ready for Series A and has a syndicate already formed, then they can just top it off with funds like ours, with just a couple of million additionally. So there is certain flexibility in the types of vehicles that larger funds and smaller funds like ours can deploy.
So Bibhash, anything to add to that? And also I have another question, which I'll ask as well. If you could comment on the role of strategics in this current landscape, and does NEA consider build-to-buy type of deals, and where does strategic investment play into this?
So, extending what Scott, Marta, and Kuldeep mentioned, personal opinion, I do think there is too much capital floating around and chasing too few good deals. So what happens, and this is especially true if you have lived through a down cycle, which perhaps many of the new capital coming in has not, is that it's a pendulum. It goes from being too little capital to too much capital. And there is always a reset that comes. It's not a question of if, it's a question of when. So for young companies, the question becomes, what if that reset comes? How would you adapt? How would your investors adapt? Will they still support you through bad times? That, I think, becomes a very key question to ask for every new company. The way to think about it is this. You're familiar with the therapeutic index concept, right? Efficacy versus tox. What's the ability to toggle that switch to understand how good your molecule is? So there is this analogous concept which I term as sort of the mistake index. So the higher if your valuation that investors are providing you are fundamentally out of whack with what your fundamental technology value is, your mistake index is very, very low. You can't afford, if you raise for a preclinical asset, $1 billion, raise money at $1 billion valuation, in order to exit that company, your investors need $3 to $5 billion an exit outcome. That's almost impossible. Show me in history where that has happened in normal times. So the higher valuation you raise at, you might be sitting on paper money today, but if the times are not as favorable, and if the generalist capital exits, and I'll come to that in a second, the chances, your ability to make mistakes and pivot and learn, which is everyday occurrence in drug development, minimizes. So what you're looking at is a very tight plan on which you have raised capital and have sold the investors on the promise. There is very little room for making mistake, and that becomes an issue. So what will presumably happen is with all these companies chasing all this money, and if the money goes away, the pool shrinks, the companies still remain and their ability to guzzle up cash still remains. So some of them will be Darwinian selection at some point. Unfortunately, that will be the case. And if you want one example, going in from privates to publics, is how many companies have become public since 2012, and how much capital have they raised? And if you project forward, 5 years from now, as to do with the cycle, as more and more capital is being pumped in at one end and the private end, all these companies going public will require an enormous amount of capital. Just do the math. I've sort of done back of the envelope. At some point of time, if the generalist investors decide that biotech, which is one of multiple asset classes for them, choose to leave, those companies will have cash crunches. So just keep that in mind as you think through. Higher valuation, big paper money is good, but it should give you sleepless nights as well. So that's the way I tend to look at it. The second question from Imran was, remind me?
Well, just on the role of strategic.
I think strategics play a very, very, very important role. Not only they're historically the buyers, but I personally think that there's this ectopic brain phenomenon that you get access to if you work with someone like Kuldeep, or if you work with any pharma, assuming they can give access to that. I'll give you a very simple and odd example here. CMC. Multiple companies completely underestimate the CMC and the regulatory capabilities required to build a drug. If you have access to someone at J&J, and I know there are people like that, who have worked for 30 years on all aspects of development CMC, and have that individual through Kuldeep look at your company and give you advice, there is nothing like that. I have seen this come across during doing diligence on assets, and importantly, the ability to anticipate mistakes comes with what I call scars of drug discovery, which is perhaps best kept in strategic organizations. So not only from a financial outcome and the obvious, you have the credibility and the brand of a J&J on your board and advisory board and so on, but this resident expertise and the ability to tap into that through a strategic investor or a partner is, I think, beyond the capital that they bring. General principle, I always love that with my own portfolio companies, our portfolio companies, and in general, when we look at new companies, prefer to have strategics.
Absolutely, and I can add to that strategic investors actually give a very defined goal and focus for a company to go after. And in particular, if it's a big pharma, to your point, there are very clear no-go, no-go decisions that are based on data, that are based on really making sure you do have an investigational drug that's ready to be put into humans in phase 1. That we're not going to see any surprises, et cetera, et cetera. So strategic investors, I believe, I haven't seen the data, have a higher probability of exiting and getting the valuation that they think.
Well, let me ask another question. Oh, sorry.
Okay,
Yeah, please continue.
I do want to actually go back to, you had asked the question, I think it's important to point out, you had asked the question that, there is too much cash and sometimes the valuation is unrealistically high and that's a negative. But I think it's important, before we move on to another question, to appreciate that actually having a lot of cash, has its advantages. And one of the key advantages, I think, in having a lot of cash is that it gives you a longer runway, which for early stage opportunities, that are sort of right at the phase of discovery that's transitioning into a translational path forward. You need that, especially if it's truly innovative and it has the potential to have breakthrough qualities. If you don't have that runway that comes with the cash, it does not allow you to adapt. You made the point that drug discovery is never straightforward. And you have to twist and turn to get to the point. Sometimes the science is very immature, and you're going to work on a potential target, and you're going to find out, oh my God, the science is telling us to go in a different disease, in a different direction. And the amount of cash that you raise, I think gives you that runway to do that. And I'll give you an example. Moderna, I think perhaps a very good example. I mean, they have obviously an RNA-based platform, it's a vaccine-based platform. It's a therapeutic platform, and there was just a lot of enthusiasm that that's going to yield very quickly therapeutics that can move into the clinic, and they raised a lot of money. Now, I can imagine, and there are examples of that we can talk about if you're interested, how they twisted and turned in terms of making sure that they could truly manufacture at scale RNA that was going to serve as a therapeutic, that it wasn't going to degrade, that it was consistently being produced in a certain way. That required a lot of cash, right? And they were, of course, very good that they had strategic partners, big pharma, that had very specific applications. Cancer vaccines that used RNA as sort of the source. So they are. I don't want the audience to go away that there are disadvantages of having a large amount of investment, cash at your disposal. Sometimes it's needed. Okay, and we can get into the fact that that in itself has, I think, changed the investor landscape where I think the mechanism and the way VCs deploy that cash is very different today, especially in ecosystems like Boston or San Francisco, where VCs like Third Rock and Polaris and Atlas Ventures are really defining a new way of investing, which is a little bit different than I think from traditional investments, and we can get into that if that's approved. So anyway, sorry to digress, but
that's really
I wanted
good.
to make sure that.
Super helpful, and I think it is a really important point, I think, and I think, I would say largely depends upon the type of company, the type of drug that you're looking to develop, platform versus not, et cetera. So I want to ask one more question on this topic, then I'm going to open it up to questions before we jump to the next topic, so I want to make sure that we have time for that. So let's go back over to Scott for this question. It's a huge topic, regulatory, the FDA. I'm wondering if you could comment on how has the evolution of the FDA impacted your thoughts and your strategy on investing in early stage life sciences?
So I would say for us, the regulatory environment kind of cycles similar to the markets a little bit, and right now, from our perspective, I think we're in a pretty, FDA-friendly environment. I think that's partly driven by the leadership at the FDA now. Scott Gottlieb is, as many of you may know, spent some time at a venture firm and could be one of the firms on this panel. So I think having that perspective is always helpful. What we found with our companies is that the FDA has been a lot more collaborative the last 5 years than maybe the last 15 years. And I think that's been really helpful. They seem more open-minded to think about different programs to have accelerated approval and just more interactions with them to get more color. From our perspective, the bar has not changed in terms of what you need to show to get approval. For oncology, I think you can get approval faster sometimes because they're really, as you go into last line patients, there are not many other options. So you see accelerated approvals, maybe more than you have in the past. But overall, we think this is a great regulatory environment. We encourage you to take advantage of the FDA's willingness to interact with them. We found that helpful with a lot of our companies. And as always, make sure you go into FDA meetings prepared. Make sure you listen to what they say. Make sure you get minutes that reflects what you thought happened in the meeting, which is very important. And we tell all our companies who think they can take shortcuts because the FDA seems flexible, you cannot do that still. And make sure you are following guidelines. But overall, this is a more friendly, from our perspective, environment if you think about the spectrums on average.
Anything to add to that, Marta? And I think specifically, if you have, are there any examples of companies that you've seen that have been able to, and I guess in recent times, take advantage of I guess, the friendlier regulatory environment, or anything in general you would add to your perspective on how the FDA has evolved?
Yeah, I would like to echo what Scott has said, the willingness of the FDA to be a partner in the clinical trial design. And we like to see our, especially preclinical stage companies, engaged in FDA conversations sooner than later, because they can really point you in the right direction and save quite a lot of money to everyone and a lot of heartache. In terms of how the regulatory environment has actually shifted where we deploy our capital. At Agent Capital, we focus on rare diseases, immunology, oncology, and neurology. And these areas have quite well-established path to approval in a lot of instances. At the same time, certain indications are less capital intensive to put through the regulatory approval and clinical trial design. So when we sit down with our companies that have platform technology, we like to also hear the story of how can the clinical proof of concept be achieved in a very pragmatic, time-sensitive and cost-sensitive manner. And I think that is what has really accelerated the oncology and or rare diseases area specifically is that willingness of the FDA to accelerate these approvals and grant breakthrough therapies. So, yeah.
All right, this is, I think, I guess our hand go up, so I want to take a little bit of time before we go to the next topic, which is strategies or best practices for accessing capital. So any questions from the audience on the current topic of the funding landscape or anything we've discussed? I think I saw her hand up first. Could you please state your name and the firm you represent?
I'm Mary Blofeld. I'm CEO of a company called Innovara, and there's a lot happening in China, and really to the point of innovation being encouraged by government, a lot of it targeted for the populations outside of China, not just in China. So has your attitude toward investing or looking at the China opportunities with all the startups and some of the really good companies there in research?
Maybe I can just start as a small first-time fund. We have a bandwidth issue, and so we believe there's a high opportunity in China. And we were actually at Baxter Ventures, we were an LP in a couple of China-based funds because we didn't have feet on the ground to really understand what was happening, but we felt confident enough in investing in China-based funds with our backing. That's how we got access, and we knew that those VC funds could actually provide the right thing. So there are ways to invest in China for funds like ours, where we can't open a Beijing or Shanghai office right now, to indirectly invest in funds that deploy capital there. So it really depends on the fund strategy, and oftentimes when venture funds are raising funds and going out to the institutional investors, the strategy has to be set. So for us, the cycle is almost, we're not able to expand that strategy for Fund 1, but we are actively looking for a Fund 2 strategy. And we're quite impressed with some of the changes that are being done at the Chinese FDA to mimic more the pathways of the US FDA and to synchronize and consolidate things. And then also the reform of the IP landscape, where much more innovation and stronger IP protection would be there. So it's almost like the second or the third wave of innovation is going to China, and one has to really know the market, has local partners. I think that's critical from what our experience is previous as an LP in China-based funds. So we're definitely keeping it on our radar, and I'm really excited about what's happening.
I guess I'll add, maybe from a company perspective. So, 15 years ago, we would even debate, should we, file IP in China or not? Is it worth the $50,000 or whatever it is? And sometimes it was no. So shift to today, we now view China as a real opportunity for our portfolio companies. And now we're encouraging them to think about, partners on the ground there, which we think is important to help navigate the regulatory system. But it is a real market opportunity, whereas before we probably just didn't focus on it. So that's part of the strategy. We're seeing, again, a lot more. We have investors in our funds from Asia and China, and so there's interest there as they think about what's the models, how the models run in the US, and how can that come back to China. And we are seeing a lot more investors from China coming into the US companies. And we have co-invested with several of them. And I think they are taking those practices and implementing them in China as well. As a fund, we likely won't invest in China because we believe you have to be hands-on, and it's just too long of a flight. And unless we have an office there, it'll be challenging. But for companies, we do encourage our companies now to think about a China strategy.
Maybe we'll take one or two more.
I mean, I can quickly add to to what has been said about the way at least J&J looks at making investments in China. Of course, they've outlined the challenges, right? Having manufacturing facilities there is key, to get into their regulatory process. Having said that, I'll give one example of an investment J&J made into a CAR T company called Legend. We did that almost a year ago, or a little less than a year ago. And I think from a strategic perspective, the way we look at it is that if there is indeed a innovative approach, and that's really key, because you got to remember that the innovative medicines that get approved in the Western world today are almost 3, if not 5 years, ahead of where China is, and they have to play catch up. But there are, I shouldn't say rarely, but every so often opportunities like in the CAR T space where Legend was making headway in getting into the clinic very, very quickly. So we looked at that as an opportunity where we could work with them, we collaborated with them to continue doing the studies in China, but certainly then acquiring the rights to develop it in the rest of the world. So from a strategy perspective, that's what J&J has done. And as you can imagine, we're very, as I said in my introduction, we're very, very mindful of enabling innovation in local ecosystems. So consequently, we do have an innovation center in Shanghai. We announced 3 or 4 months ago or longer that we're going to open an incubator facility. One of our J-Labs facilities is going to be in Shanghai. And again, what we're hoping is that we would enable local innovation to come up. And I think there is going to be a time in the foreseeable future where innovation is going to come out, given the talent that's over there, given the amount of capital that's available to be deployed. So it's something to really watch, and as I think you might have mentioned, as the FDA regulatory process becomes very, very similar to what's happening here in the Western world, things will move.
So one more question, and then we'll go to the next topic.
That's
Yes.
a pretty basic question. We're a new, Bill Dithenberg, chairman of Halo Biosciences. We're a new oncology biotech that has a novel approach. We literally last month got our IND. We got it in 28 days, we got it really fast. And we're curious what kind of step up in valuation does that mean relative to legitimacy to investors? And the second part of that is we're also about to start Series A funding search. And we're concerned about the whole control issue around the amount of equity that an investor would want to have in what could be a very, very exciting prospect. And so it's the valuation / the amount of capital / the control element of that we're looking for more information on. That's sort of a big question. But.
Yeah, I know it's a great question, and actually it does filter into the next topic very well, so it's a good transition. Anyone want to comment on that?
I can take a stab. These are all sort of TBD. Without knowing the specifics, it's almost impossible to give you a number. I'll be throwing a dart in the darkness.
We're not looking for a number, just the concepts of it.
Yeah, concepts. So obviously you'll have step up in valuation is a function of 2 things. 1, what base you are starting from, and 2, the progress achieved. So if you fundamentally think about the fundamental tech value that you have generated by submitting the IND, there is logically bound to be some kind of step up, but that in turn depends on where you're starting from. If you're starting from 5, and if you're going, and expecting a 40, you have to justify that 35 delta. If you're starting from 20 and going to 40, you still have to justify that. So that's the basic framework in thinking. The other part I'll say is just because you have an IND does not mean that you have the clinical path appropriately laid out. It has to be the right IND. Goes back to the point I think Martha and Scott made around engaging with the FDA early and ensuring how this IND is a means to an end, right? It's a means to getting to an end. So if you begin with the end in mind and walk backwards, do the analysis of whether that's the right IND to go for. That's the key question, because all the FDA is giving you permission to do is run a trial. Whether that's the right kind of trial, the right kind of endpoints, the right kind of indication and all that, how the pharmacology translates, is dependent on the specifics, as you can imagine.
And I can add to that, where if you have a strategic investor, they become very mindful of precisely the points that the patient was making, right? Is the clinical development strategy outlined in a manner that is really going to get you the right answer once you start dosing patients, right? Does it have the right biomarker strategies? Is it going to address the right patient volume, et cetera, et cetera?
And the interplay between equity, ownership, and control?
Yeah, I'll give you some perspective. So this is in general, not to your specific company, but when we make an investment, we have our return hurdles, and it's no secret. We try to make a 5x cash-on-cash return if we make an investment. And so what we would do with your company, we would say, where are you today? How much capital you need to raise to hit certain inflection points, and we think you could either go public or get acquired. And then we discount that back, and we need to make our returns, and then we come up to a mathematical number, and there's a range, and that's the negotiation that we have. So, I mean, it's not a big secret, and so we tell companies should know how VCs think.
So you're looking at 5X?
That's our.
But I'm not in a technology world where it's 10X.
Then you should be glad you're in life sciences. But I think the failure rate's a little bit higher there, so they have a different hurdle. And so that's how we think about it. And so you can do your own math. So we've had companies that have started the first round, the pre-money's been 50, and it made sense. We make sure companies don't get ahead of themselves. IPOs historically go out in certain ranges and stages of developments. And so if we see a company that's going into a phase one and their value is at 100 million, then the question is, does that math work? Can they go public? And if not, we just walk away. So don't get ahead of yourself is one point. And then I think your other question was around control. So that's the interesting question. So VCs love to have control. Companies don't like that. My advice to companies is the following. Venture capital is the most expensive equity out there. If you can avoid it, I highly recommend you avoid it, to be honest. Unfortunately, not everyone can. So if you can't convince Kuldeep to do a big partnership with J&J and it's non-dilutive, that's great. If not, then you may have to have a negotiation with your venture partners what control provisions they want and what you're willing to live with, whether that's voting, whether that's a board, etc. I think that just goes to the importance of picking your venture partners very carefully. Part of the reason it takes our firm takes 6 to 9 months to do diligence on a company on average before investing. We want to get to know the CEO and the team, how they're going to act in good times and bad times, because there will be both in an investment. So that's very important to us. It's like a 9-month interview for us, in essence. And we encourage companies to do the same. Understand, there are a lot of new funds out there, so you don't know the track record of them. It's not good or bad, you just don't know. So understand how firms react when companies have, achievements and failures, and how they will behave, and whether capital will still be there, which is all important. And so that's probably more important than control provisions. But if you invest with the right team, whether for us, the CEOs and management, for you guys, the syndicate, then the control won't feel as controlled.
I can't stress that enough. There are 2 types of boards, one that you love going to, one that you don't. The ones that you don't want to go to and face are typically adversarial relationships. It has either started that way. Shame on us for not foreseeing that. And in some ways, it's very deleterious to a company when the management team and the board and individual investors in a board are not on the same page. Because the way, one way to think about, the management's job is to shepherd the company. In some ways, the investor's job is to provide the means to do so. So in some ways, you're means to the end. But at the end of the day, you're on the same team. So if you go into a discussion thinking that control is a key issue for us and I'm not going to yield, in some ways that introduces the adversarial thinking right at the outset. So the first question that, to Scott's point is, in terms of selecting investors, what you should think about, at least as a framework, is, can I work with these individuals and funds for the next 8 years? If the answer to that you perceive is no, and people have preferences, right? Then this is similar to making a quick goodbye at the dating stage, as opposed to pursuing the relationship. And it's mutual. To that point, we invest very significant amounts of time and effort in getting to know a company. And this is what I call, this might sound in some ways a bit trite, but at the end of the day, philosophy of building a company between the management team and the investors is paramount. If you're not on the same planet, it's not a good investment, however 15x you might get.
Good. I think we've pretty much filtered into the next topic of conversation, so maybe I'll just pose one question and then again open it up to Q&A. But just one really quick comment on what you said earlier. So I think one of the big points is that in healthcare, it's a very capital-intensive industry, right? And so having access to capital for the long run is really crucial. And therefore, I think having access to venture funding and even the public markets eventually is going to be very important. And eventually, you likely will have to give up some control. We're actually out of time, so I think that thankfully we actually touched on the last topic of conversation. But so since we're out of time, just want to say thank you once again to our panelists. I think we had a very lively and fruitful discussion, and thanks to all of you for joining us.